Carol's story is one of generosity met with ingratitude and manipulation. She lives contentedly with her husband, Michael, and their son, Jacob, valuing the love and support that fills their home. Michael, a deeply kind and hands-on father, shares the responsibilities of the household and nurtures a strong bond with their son. However, beneath this picture of domestic happiness lies a growing tension involving Carol's older brother, Brian, and his wife, Amy. For years, Carol has been financially supporting her family, particularly her mother, Samantha, who had retired and moved into the family home now occupied by Brian and Amy. Despite sending $2,000 every month, Carol's relationship with Brian and Amy became increasingly strained, especially when they assumed control over managing the finances. Amy's persistent and demanding attitude about the money, along with her subtle undermining of Carol, often criticizing her as a mother and making comparisons to Brian, began to overshadow Carol's well-intentioned contributions. Amy's hostility toward Carol was evident from the very beginning, marked by harsh remarks and an unsettling, out-of-place fashion choice that Carol found difficult to ignore. Despite this, Carol remained focused on maintaining peace, leaning on the support of her husband. Though accepting Amy into the family felt like an ongoing struggle, the tipping point came when a heated phone conversation about a supposed debt of $15,000 led Carol to a moment of clarity. Firm in her resolve, she ended the call and made the life-changing decision to cut off all financial assistance to Brian and Amy. This was not a choice Carol made lightly, but after years of her generosity being met with contempt, it was a necessary stand for her dignity. Amidst these family conflicts, Carol often found herself worrying about her mother, Samantha, who lived with Brian and Amy. Between juggling her job and caring for Jacob, Carol had a hard time keeping in touch with her mother and was left in the dark about Samantha's well-being. One morning, as Carol was preparing for her day after dropping Jacob off at childcare, a surprise phone call from Samantha disrupted her routine. The anger in her mother's voice was jarring as she demanded to know where the monthly financial support was. Despite Carol's reassurance that the money had been sent directly to Brian's account, Samantha accused her of neglecting her duties and, in a hurtful twist, threatened to sever ties unless Carol sent an additional $115,000. Reeling from the harsh accusations, Carol tried to make sense of the situation, but her attempts were met with further blame. Feeling confused and betrayed, she ended the call, vowing to get to the bottom of the misunderstanding. Her gut told her that Amy was behind the manipulation, given the confrontational demands she'd made in the past. The following month, the pattern repeated itself. Amy called to remind Carol of the approaching payment deadline. When Carol asked about the previous month's conflict, Amy dismissed her concerns, urging Carol to speak directly to Brian if there were any issues. Acting on this advice, Carol reached out to her brother, hoping for clarity, but Brian's response, however, the full amount of the monthly support sent to Brian's account. But the revelation only deepened Carol's shock. Brian confessed that they had been diverting a portion of Carol's contributions for their personal use, leaving only a fraction for Samantha. This month, overwhelmed by their own financial pressures, they had redirected the entire sum, leaving nothing for their mother's care. The truth hit Carol hard, a painful realization that her efforts to help her mother were being misused by the very people she trusted most. Betrayed and powerless, she found herself confronting the ugly reality of her family's dysfunction. The trust she had placed in Brian and Amy had been shattered, and her financial sacrifices now seemed to have been in vain. This moment of clarity forced Carol to face the difficult truth about her brother's actions and the damaging consequences for their mother's well-being. It was a turning point, one that forced Carol to reassess her approach to both her family and her financial support. Determined to expose the truth, Carol knew she had to tell her mother what Brian had admitted. Despite her efforts to explain the situation and reassure Samantha that she had been sending the full amount, her mother remained unconvinced. Samantha accused Carol of making excuses and claimed she wasn't sending the money as promised. Desperate to provide undeniable proof, Carol suggested a video call to show her transaction history. As the call began, she presented her bank statement, clearly showing the full transfers made each month. The $155,000 transfer, however, did little to earn her mother's trust. Samantha suggested the document could be easily fabricated, parroting skepticism she'd heard in the news about digital deception. She insisted on seeing the actual money transferred, and, when Carol tried to explain, the conversation ended abruptly with her mother still unconvinced. Desperate to prove her sincerity, Carol reluctantly arranged another transfer, hoping this gesture would finally convince her mother. But the situation only worsened. A few days later, Carol received an unexpected late-night call from her mother, revealing that the money had still not reached its intended destination. Confused and frustrated, Carol reached out to her brother, only to be met with cold indifference and a refusal to discuss the matter. Her patience thinned further after a revealing conversation with Amy, who unapologetically admitted that she had used the transferred funds for a personal purchase, a designer bag, rather than for their intended purpose. To add insult to injury, Amy demanded another $200, showing blatant disregard for the family's needs. Betrayed and infuriated, Carol knew it was time to confront the situation head-on. She packed her bags and headed to her parents' house, determined to face her family and address the misuse of her financial support. Carol's journey from a devoted sister and daughter to a disillusioned family member underscored the complexities of familial obligations and the deep impact of trust shattered by selfish actions. Her unexpected arrival at her parents' home took both Brian and Amy by surprise. Her mother, still hopeful for a resolution, greeted Carol with the expectation of financial assistance. But Carol, resolute in her mission, asked to see Brian's bank card to verify the $155,000 transfer. Amy's evasive and reluctant responses only fueled Carol's determination. The confrontation quickly escalated, with Amy deflecting questions and Carol demanding transparency. Things reached a boiling point when their mother, frustrated and possibly in denial, sided with Amy, urging Carol to leave and even renouncing her as a daughter. In the heat of the moment, Carol stood firm, announcing her decision to stop the financial support due to the deceit she had uncovered. She exposed the truth about how her contributions were misallocated, challenging her family's view of Brian and Amy. Carol's departure from the house was a turning point, a clear statement that she would no longer enable their dishonesty, no matter the consequences. When she returned home, Michael was there to offer comfort and support, affirming her decision to end the payments. His reassurance reminded Carol that her generosity had always been a voluntary act of goodwill, not an obligation to sustain her adult brother and his wife, or to cover up their lack of responsibility. This realization, coupled with Michael's unwavering understanding, brought Carol a sense of peace. Finally free from an obligation that had long burdened her, she embraced the relief of knowing that her brother and Amy were fully capable of supporting themselves. Carol's journey from a dutiful family member to an empowered individual highlighted the critical importance of setting boundaries and having the courage to uphold them in the face of manipulation and ingratitude. For years, Carol had been the pillar of her family, shouldering the financial burdens caused by her brother's irresponsibility and her mother's reliance. It was a role she had taken on without question, never fully considering why the weight of these responsibilities always seemed to fall on her. Her husband, Michael, had quietly observed this dynamic with concern, recognizing the toll it was taking on Carol, though he refrained from intervening, believing it was her decision to make. He supported her from the sidelines. However, when Carol finally decided to prioritize her immediate family, herself, Michael, and their son Jacob, Michael fully backed her decision. He reassured her that while offering help in times of crisis was noble, it was not her responsibility to fund her brother and mother's day-to-day lives. This affirmation from Michael gave Carol the confidence she needed to free herself from her self-imposed obligations. Yet, in an ironic twist, Her resolution was quickly tested when Brian and Amy reached out, demanding the usual financial support. Mid-month, Carol responded firmly. She had already made the decision to cease the monthly payments. She emphasized that her intentions were clear, and that her priorities had shifted. That they had each other for support. The conversation ended with Carol reaffirming her stance and disconnecting. The situation quickly escalated when Amy confronted Carol outside her home, aggressively demanding the $15,000 for her personal indulgences. Using their mother's care as justification, Carol, stunned by Amy's audacity, reiterated that their financial arrangement was over and firmly told Amy not to return. Amy's outburst attracted attention, and the police were called, an intervention Carol hadn't expected but which starkly highlighted the gravity of the situation. Shaken but resolute, Carol reached out to her brother, seeking an explanation for Amy's actions and to reinforce her decision to sever financial ties. She expressed how their constant demands were taking a toll on her family, particularly on her son, and made it clear that she wanted no part in the ongoing cycle of dependency and conflict. The silence that followed her assertive stance from Brian spoke volumes. It marked the definitive end of Carol's financial support and signified the beginning of a new chapter focused on her immediate family's well-being. Carol had reached her breaking point with her family's financial demands, when Brian, in a final attempt to sway her, admitted that both he and Amy worked part-time and depended heavily on their mother's modest pension, claiming they couldn't survive without Carol's $15,000 contributions. Carol remained unmoved. Despite acknowledging Amy's extravagant spending habits, Brian insisted that they needed the full amount to cover their living expenses. Carol, resolute and unmoved by his justifications, pointed out their minimal support for their mother and decisively ended the conversation. She vowed to cut off all communication with them, knowing that her decision was final. In the months that followed, Carol stood firm in her decision, ignoring the persistent pleas from her brother and the occasional attempts from Amy, who had become notably less present at Carol's doorstep since the police incident. The situation took another turn when Carol received a call from her mother, who tearfully revealed that she had been financially neglected by Brian and Amy, receiving neither the promised portion of Carol's contributions nor any meaningful support from them. Her mother's plea was filled with regret and despair over her situation, as well as the mistreatment she had suffered at the hands of her son and daughter-in-law. Despite her mother's vulnerable state, Carol's sympathy was tempered by the painful history of betrayals and the harsh ultimatum she had been forced to accept. Carol had navigated life on her own, financing her college education and even taking on her brother's student loans, a burden that was never hers to carry. Given the years of sacrifice and manipulation, she suggested that her mother take a firm stand and evict Brian and Amy, stressing that they were capable adults who needed to take responsibility for their own lives. Following Carol's advice, her mother made the difficult decision to evict them, forcing Brian and Amy to move into an older, less comfortable apartment. While this decision brought some relief, it also created a distance between Carol and her mother, marked by an awkward silence and diminished contact. When her brother later reached out, confessing to the debt he and Amy had accrued due to her sister-in-law's extravagant spending, Carol chose to maintain her distance. She focused instead on the well-being of her own immediate family, putting the needs of her husband and son above the toxic pull of her extended family. This decision marked a turning point in Carol's life, one where she prioritized her peace and the stability of her home over the endless emotional and financial drain that Brian and Amy had come to represent. Carol's story became a testament to the power of setting boundaries and the courage to enforce them, even when faced with the complex dynamics of family loyalty and obligation.